Now, we're recording Bruce Briggs, and this is May the 13th. And I'll leave it to questions I'm going to ask him, and he's going to tell me.
All right.
Okay. Now, how did you find out about the waterfront?
Through my brother. He was a longshoreman at the time. And, of course, my father was a longshoreman, so we are the second generation of 4 generations that are on the waterfront now, and growing in generations. Mm-hmm. Also, my very first job on the waterfront, when I walked into local 502 dispatch hall in Westminster, I was shaking because I was only 15 years old at the time. Mm-hmm. And go in there and see all these big husky men and everything that looked a little rough around the edges, and you didn't give them any lip, or you got a fat lip. Right. And my very first job on the waterfront was a water boy on an afternoon shift. And I met my dad on the gangplank. He was just heading home, and I was just heading to work. And head boss at the time was Bill Phelan, and Jerry Phelan was on the hatch, and there happened to only be one gang on this ship this evening. And they kind of knew me through my dad as a youngster. And Bill came up to me and says, "What are you doing, Bruce?" And I says, "Well, I'm supposed to be a water boy, and I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing." And Mr. Phelan just said, "Come with me." And we walked to the hatch, and it was a late dispatch, kind of. And he says, "You yell heads up to them guys down below and tell them to hook up the water can onto the hook. You give them a full can of water to take back down below. And then you come with me to where the coffee pot is and put a big coffee pot on." And I was approximately on the job for about half an hour, 45 minutes. And he says, "Okay, kid, go home." And I didn't know really what he meant at the time. I thought I was fired or whatever. I wasn't sure what was going on. So I stuck around for a few minutes, and he says, "Look it, I told you to go home." So here this young kid went running down the gangplank and clicked his heels and thought, "I kind of like this work here on this waterfront."
Yeah.
Well, then the next job I got on the waterfront was a little different. I ended up making a hand-stole lumber job. And the very first piece of wood that I ever picked up on down below was what they used to call a Fletcher at the time. And it was what they called the blue one. It felt like 1,000 pounds at the end. And the only thing I was told, "Kid, don't drop your end." And then when we moved it to where we were supposed to put it on down, the fellow I was working with so happened to be my brother. And he said, "Okay, drop your end." Well, I literally dropped it on him. So then on the next one, he said to me, he says, "Okay." And he picked the longest one out of the pack, and he says, "Make sure you don't drop your end." So the next thing, he picked his end up a little bit higher and threw his end down. I learned in a hurry, yeah, don't drop the other end on your partner.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty good.
And that was the start of my career on the waterfront.
Okay.
And then we proceeded from there. Of course, jobs were far and few in between. And I was lucky enough to still be living at home, being only 15 years old. And that, and going to school a little bit, and trying to work a little bit. And then it just carried on from there. Met a lot of great men through my career. A lot of old-time vets that would eventually maybe tell you what they went through during the war. Of course, they'd have to have a few little drinks into them before they'd loosen up. But very interesting stories from them old timers. They taught us a lot. They taught us a lot of respect. They taught us also to help one another, not like what's going on nowadays on the waterfront. The old time members back then, if they seen you doing something the wrong way, they would show you the proper way and the easier to do the job that you were on that day. And then further down the line, after you were in, got to know the job a little bit, and then you were down below, and then the fella that might be driving the winch would yell down to you, "Hey kid, get your effing ass up here." And then that was the start of our training program. If they liked you, knew you would do the work and not cry and complain, they would call you up either on the winch, if you so happen to be working out as a dockman or a slingman on the dock side, and the old timers would get you on a lift truck, start showing you how to drive a lift truck, give you a little easier job sometimes. And then after that, it was if somebody was kind of ill for the day, it wasn't any of this, "Oh, you got to book off and go home." The guys that were working with that fellow that was sick at the time would tell him to go sit in a corner, go relax, and everybody in the gang would pitch in and cover for that man.
Yes, that happened quite often.
Yes.
Yes, it was just an accepted thing to do.
Well, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, when we first started, it was 12-man gangs, 13-man gangs, and everything was done by hand back then. And if you did end up with a lift truck down on the ship that you were working, you thought you were very fortunate at the time. And then, of course, after the lumber and the fertilizer and the flour days, seen a lot of guys that barely could pick up the bags, right? But you didn't give that person a hard time. You helped them out. If you couldn't pick up the bag, somebody would go help them at the other end. It was none of this, go home. You can't do the job. But if you were really bad at doing the job, it wasn't the foreman that told you to go home. It was either the hatch tender, winch driver, or the side runner at that time. They had more authority than the foreman, I think, at that time.
Yeah, they did. They had more authority.
And then, of course, automation started coming in through the years. Of course, all the car ships and that. A little easier work, but a lot more walking through all the carbon monoxide back in them days and that. But when you went back to the hall for another dispatch, you felt good. And you just showed respect to all the fellow members at that time, even though you were a casual. Them members treated their casuals back then with respect also. Not like it is happening on the waterfront these days. It seems like the membership is bitter at the casuals nowadays on the waterfront. And till they smarten up, our union is going to start getting weaker and weaker because there is no respect amongst the fellow men amongst themselves anymore.
I noticed that. I didn't notice that. You don't notice it as much at Westshore.
That's right.
But when you go to the other end, then you notice it.
Yeah. Oh, and then, of course, we ended our career in Westminster and went to Westshore Terminals in 1996 and finished my career there for 17 and a half years at Westshore, which was a little different type of work. But when we went back there, we went back to a lot of the older guys that started on the waterfront before I did, and it was more of a family again. Like when we first started on the waterfront, of course the local was a lot smaller at that time, and it was more of a family-oriented place to work. If you did have an argument or a disagreement with somebody, it was none of this writing out a charge to go in front of the grievance. the two men would go off by themselves. One guy might come back with a fat lip or a bleedy nose, but they shook hands, and that's all that was ever said.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then, of course, with working going back to Westshore, it was like going back to all the older members at the time that have done a lot of union work, and they're still involved with the union work, like Dean is here that I'm talking with. And they were all great union men, and they stuck up for one another, and they didn't let the companies bully the younger people. And like I say, they were always willing and giving a helping hand to the new people that were starting on the waterfront.
Yes, we did. That was sort of a creed that we had
That's right.
amongst, you know. Now, some other questions I'd like to ask you. Tell us when you started and what your normal day was like on the job. If you went down to the hall for a dispatch.
Yes. Well, of course, when I first started living out in Surrey, I would catch a ride to the hall with my dad, and many a mornings we would be going across the Patella Bridge at just after 5 o'clock in the morning, the 5:30, to beat rush hour. And rush hour in them days might have been 10 vehicles on the bridge. It was mostly due for them to get to Al's pool hall in the morning to shoot a game of pool, have breakfast, and then go to walk down through the backside of Front Street and go to PCT and put a shift on the waterfront.
Now, what would happen when you got your dispatch, and let's say it was a lumber job? From the time you went to the hall, and you'd walk down to the ship.
Well, of course, when we first started, nobody had a plate or a card to put on the boards like they have now. There would be a gentleman, what we used to call the dispatcher, standing there, and after everybody off the boards were working, he would say, "Who out there wants to go to work?" And everybody would run up towards the wicket like a bunch of cattle. And then he would just point his finger, say, "Okay, you can go, and you're not, and you're going to work, and you're going to work." And that's how you got picked to go to the job. And if it was a lumber job, you just hoped it wasn't Fletcher's again.
Yeah.
You know, you used to just pray when you used to hit that lumber job that it was a brand new start right in the bottom of the hatch, and best words you heard was it was a deck load. So a lot of times when you were first starting there, you could be on that ship 3 weeks to a month to finish it off on the deck load after you hand stowed everything down below. And your hands got a little sore if you didn't have gloves, and if you didn't have a pair of leather gloves or any type of gloves to wear, there would be a hatch tender or a winch driver or an older member that would take his gloves off and give it to the young person that was starting out. And many a times you would come home and you'd be so tired at the dinner table that you'd almost fall asleep. And then just after dinner, you would look at mom and dad and say, "I gotta go to bed."
That was a lot.
And then you started thinking, maybe we should have stayed in school a little longer.
Yeah.
But it was a great place to work my whole career on the waterfront. I have no bad words about the waterfront at all.
Can you tell about setting gear?
Yeah, that was a different story when you first started doing it. They would ask you how if you knew anything about setting gear, and the one place you always used to like going was what they used to call the lazy guide. All you had to do is grab a hold of the rope and let the rope out a little bit at a time as they swung the booms around to in position where they were going to shackle them down and take the tension by the winch. And after they took the tension by the winch, you would pull on this rope on the lazy guide so that the rope in between the two booms would be a little snug, and you would cinch it down, and then they would drop the two winch lines down to you to make sure that the hook was on. And then you just stood back and you watched the old timers look at all the running gear on the cables on the winches to make sure they were all safe, and of course all the pad eyes and pins on the shackles. Even back then, safety was a big concern, and them old longshoremen, they would not let them foremen tell you that it was safe when it was unsafe. They just not would go to work. And then, of course, you would have to get a BA out. And then after that, it would be the DOT. And then after the DOT either passed it or failed it. And you always hoped that they failed it at the time, so that you knew that maybe you would get an extra shift of work out of it. And then after everything was settled, and then you would put your head down and your arsehole up.
Did you uncovering the hatch in the old days? Would you do that by hand?
Yes, the old wooden hatch covers, and I think they were roughly 8 to 10 feet long.
Yeah,
maybe a foot wide,
or 2 feet,
or 2 feet, some of them. And your first experience of that, you would lift that hatch cover off by hand. And then you would see nothing but darkness down for about 90 feet. And if you're a little leery about height, you're a little nervous taking them hatch covers off. It wasn't so bad while the wooden covers were on, but then after they were all gone, well, now you had to take the beams out. And you just hoped that you had 2 good winch drivers at the time. There wasn't anything worse than having to dodge a beam that would be swinging in the air, especially if you didn't have very good escape routes at the time. And another thing the old timers would teach you is never get into the bite. And what we used to call the bite is where you could get seriously injured, or even death would occur. Same with when we used to rig gear. I just happened to be on what they used to call the Thor 3 boat. It was nickel Matty ore at the time, and a good friend of mine, his father was setting gear, and at that time the boom let loose, and the cable from the winch caught this person and almost literally cut that man in half. And at the age I was only at, around 19 at the time, and that was one of the first deaths I've ever seen on the waterfront, and it was something I wished I would never see again, which I can say has happened a few other times since that time. So people that think the waterfront was a safe place to work at that time, you really got your eyes open. It through the years at the start was a very dangerous place to be, and so anytime there was knowledge to be passed down from one older longshoreman to the younger one, you made sure that you listened to what that man was saying to you, because sometime it could have been your life that of course you wouldn't have been here to be talking about it now. So you always learn to take advice from an older member. They've been there a lot longer than you have, and I wish the younger generation would go back to the old practice to helping each person there, not just members. And don't forget, your casuals are still one of the backbones of your industry.
Right. Well, when we longshored, we knew all the aspects of longshoring. But now you have members who have only driven bomb cart or something, and they don't know any other part of longshoring.
That's right.
And so they're not being trained about steel or anything else. It's too bad. So, what else did you do when you worked in your career? You went from down below, hand stow. What other jobs did you have?
Oh, of course, we any chance that we were called up to get on the winch handles, we would go and do that. And my personal self, I liked doing it, but I always felt that was one of the most dangerous jobs to do, from hurting somebody else underneath you or whatever. And I didn't want to have a mistake on them winches or anything like that. So very seldom I would go on the winch. I wasn't that confident in my ability on them handles. Maybe that's why I stayed away from that job. And then I proceeded to go from doing a lot of lift truck driving on the ships, off the ships, which I found very interesting at the time. Of course, some of the jobs that you'd never done before, there would be another older longshoreman that would give you a few little tricks to learn, and you felt good when you could maybe carry a pack of lumber or I-beams or whatever that were 40 feet long. And of course, back down in them days at PCT, on the water side of the sheds, they were pretty narrow in through there. So, and then when you had to take some of your cargo into the sheds, you learned in a hurry how to get them longer pieces of lumber or whatever you were carrying through the doorways or down the dock face to where you ended up having to put them out in the yard or whatever. And so you got to be able to drive lift trucks pretty good. And then, of course, it was from lift trucks, and then you went to when they started bringing in the car ships. You always enjoyed being the dockman back then, because then you got to drive the vehicles. There was no row ships back then. It was all done by gear. And so you always hope that you're out on the dock so you could drive these new vehicles. And then, of course, after that, we never shied away from the physical work either, because if you didn't do it all, your paychecks weren't that big. And also back then, the wages, what we earned back then seemed to go a lot further than they do today. And then, of course, after that, like I say, we went to Westshore, and then it was pretty well all the sitting down and running equipment with your hands. And every once in a while, you had to get a shovel or a water hose and spray some coal around. But through the years, it was a pretty easy gig there too. It was like I say, once in a while you had to do a little physical work, but you did a lot more sitting and just watching back then.
Okay, tell me what you thought of PCT Dock. Describe PCT Dock and what that was like working there.
Oh, PCT, that would more or less start right from Patella Bridge and all the way down to the Westminster Quay is now, or they used to call 1A and 1B. And it was quite interesting there, especially in Westminster, where all the sheds were. Was very little room between the sheds to the end of the dock face. well, then you would look up the river, and back then you might see, what, 10 ships in port?
Yep.
And back then, of course, it was all mostly standing gear, and there might be 5, 6 gangs to a ship, and each gang would have 12 men in it. So if you had, say, 5 ships with 5 hatches, that would be 25 hatches at 12 men to a hatch. Back in them days, ships created a lot of work for our local, and it was a neat place to work. The buildings were roughly, what, 80 years old at the time?
Oh yeah, 80 years old at that time.
Maybe 100 years old. And once in a while, when you would be walking in the sheds, you would see initials of some fellow old-time longshoreman that left his initials on the wall. And that initial that you might be looking at could be up to 100 years old. So it was very interesting at the time.
Oh yes. Now, tell us about the pad ships.
Oh, the pad ships. The first time we seen the pad ship, they lowered the ramp at the aft end of the ship, and then everybody would be driving the lift trucks, or what they call the bomb carts nowadays, down. Of course, your lift truck drivers would be down below on certain decks, or above on certain decks, waiting for the ramp runner to bring in the lumber to you, and then you would take the lumber off the bomb cart and start stowing it. And back then, you would go 7 high. The odd time they try to get you to go higher than 7, but back then we put on a limit that you could only go 7 high with the lumber, and you made sure that you always put a cant that would always work away from where you were working at the time. And of course, the odd time when the fans weren't working properly, it would get a little smoky down there with common monoxide and that. And then you would head outside of the ship and get some fresh air into you, and wait for the fans to get working, and clear everything out of the deck at the time that you were working.
Did you have any good times on the pad ship?
Oh,
like a party or
I have to say, in our career on the waterfront, more or less right from day one to the day I retired, it was like being at a party every day. There were a few parties that I can remember that kind of got out of hand, but back in them days, it seemed like if you did have a drink or two, especially when you're on a hand stow in Westminster or even at Surrey Dock, you would have 4 men on each side, and then if a little bit of drinking would get starting, well, then they would, one side would always try and hang the hook on the other side. And what I mean about hanging the hook was, if you got your load finished before the other side, and they were the next one to get the load, you just sat down and you waited till they finished that load off to get their next load, and then your winch driver would bring you the other load, and then you would carry on. So, like I say, it was a few times the parties might have got out of hand. But it was still a learning experience, and an experience that I will never forget.
One thing I would like you to tell, what's your experience about nickel Matty?
Oh,
which I hated doing.
Yes, on the nickel Matty, the first time I went down below and seen that, you would think, okay, it's just like rocks. Well, then if you picked up a rock that, say, was maybe what you would think might have been only 20, 30 pounds, well, nickel Matty would roughly weigh 150 to 200 pounds. It is one of the most heaviest cargoes that I've ever picked up in my life. So the trick was back then was you always went for the smallest one.
Yeah.
And many times you would have to roll it into a bucket. Maybe two men would be trying to roll this good size piece of nickel Matty into the bucket. And then when you hooked up the bucket and they were going to lift it out of the hatch, and one of the worst things that could happen was if your winch driver bumped it and a hook would come out and everything that you already put in that bin come rolling out and you would have to redo it all over.
Yeah.
And many of broken fingernails. Some men more likely got bad breaks on their fingers with the nickel Matty rolling down onto their fingers. And like I say, in about 2 or 3 weeks, you would lose that fingernail and start a fresh one all over.
Right, that's what you do. Cut fingers off. I didn't like that job at all.
Well,
Well, now at PCT, how many berths were there? Was it?
oh, gee.
You had 1A.
Yeah, 1A, 1B, 1C, and then of course up towards Patella Bridge was what they called door 10. After you got dispatched out of the hall, you would have to go see whoever the foreman on the dock side that day, and you used to all meet at what they used to call door 10, and there'd be a little office inside, and the foreman there would look at your dispatch slip and assign you to whatever portion of the shed that you were supposed to go work, or if you were a dockman that was assigned to a hatch at the ship, of course then you would just go around to where your the hatch was, and if it was a brand new start, and then they would show you where they had want the cargo, and then you would just make sure that you would have blocks or set down for the cargo at the time that you were working, or even so, sometimes if it was peas or whatever, and the bags split up. Of course, then you were handed a broom and a dustpan and a garbage can, and you were put to work sweeping her up and cleaning up.
Yeah, that's what you're doing.
And to be honest, I honestly can't remember how many berths there were in Westminster, but I'm trying to think it was in between 10 or 12 berths. Because I think the Westminster side, they could get up to 12 ships on the whole of Westminster side.
Yeah, I think it was 12. And if you had Liberty ships, because they were smaller ships,
That's right.
you could get up to 15.
Yes.
Because they were Liberty ships.
Yeah.
And they weren't that long.
And actually, one of my first times to over to Fraser, Surrey, they still had the tower, the wheat tower.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
shed.
They still had that. The grain
The grain
elevator.
Grain elevator.
Mm-hmm.
I can honestly say I never had a worked grain.
Oh yeah.
Right. Had to do the grain when we went to Vancouver on traveling time. Well, when they used to send us buses into the dispatch hall, and all of us would jump on the bus and go to Vancouver, and a couple times we had to do the wheat, and of course then you were given a shovel to do the ribs and everything on the ship, and that was another job that I really didn't care for.
No. Now, what different types of jobs did you do in your career? I mean, there was loading lumber, there was sacks. What type of sacks there was, and different cargoes did you put on a ship?
Oh, well, of course, when we used to go to rice mills, which was a little further from Fraser Wharves. Well, then you knew it was anywhere at the start. If it was the rice or the wheat, you knew the bags were anywhere from 200 to 250 pounds. And of course, you had to have 2 people on them bags. One of the worst things about it was if the bags were small enough that one man could handle, you'd try and grab them, and they would just roll all over, and there was nothing to hold on to.
Right.
and so then of course, then it was burlap sacks, so you used to get a lot of burlap sack burns on your forearms and whatever. And then, of course, we went from that size bag down to the 110-pound bags, which at that time we thought were very light. And, of course, that was going almost to the fertilizer days. And after you got a little rash on your forearms carrying them bags, and the fertilizer would start getting into your forearms where you got a rash, you learned how that fertilizer would sting. So you were trying to make sure you always wore long sleeve shirts when you worked that cargo. But yeah, and then we only twice in my whole career on the waterfront that we ever had to do cow hides. And that was an experience and a half when they...
Tell us about that experience.
You would be walking towards a ship, and you would get such an ugly odor, and at that time didn't realize that odor was coming to where you were going to be about to work. And then when we uncovered the hatch cover there, you'd look down and you would swear that everything was moving down there. And of course, by the time you got down below where these cowhides were, and if you could tolerate the stink from it, and then you realize what all that movement was that you were watching from above. And if you don't realize what it was maggots. And the very top of the tray where they'd have the cowhides sitting on, the very top one wasn't too bad because they were kind of dry. But the further you worked down below onto the pallet board, the sloppier they would get, and the juices from the hide would, if you weren't smart enough to put some kind of rain gear on, or even put ask for a roll of poly so that you could kind of make an apron for yourself. And if you didn't have that on, and then after the shift, you were sent to the back of the bus because nobody would sit beside you. and if you were really bad, they might even not let you on the bus.
Right, that is something.
Actually, I pretty well. I think I've worked every commodity that in my whole career at the time, whatever it was. I honestly think that I worked a little bit of it all, from anywhere from cowhides to flour to fertilizer to lumber, steel coils.
Did you ship out any in the freezers? Any apples or anything like that?
Yes, of course. Yeah, that was a pretty good job. And if you did happen to be able to taste some of the dried apples that BC used to send out away from here, you knew that you were eating the best apple that come off the tree. And of course, and then when we started bringing different fruits into the port, like kiwi, the first time I had a taste of kiwi was on a ship at PCT for a new type of fruit, which was very tasty at the time. And of course we had the pineapples and.
Was there anything like liquor ships coming in?
Oh, there was many a liquor ships, and many a times the foreman would tell you, whatever you do, you don't break into the cargo. But if there's any loose cargo sitting around, be our guest. and they must have knew something back then, because if you did happen to get into any of the loose cargo and start having the odd drink or two, of course, it seemed like production would pick up through the night. and the old theory back then is as long as you keep that hook going, there's not a problem. But if the hook ain't moving, then there's a problem.
Yeah.
So if you want to have a few drinks, just make sure the hook is always moving.
Oh, yes, that was good. Was there never a time that you got drunk on the job?
Oh, I have to admit there was a few times. But like I say, if you did drink too much where you couldn't do the job, one of your fellow workers always told you, go in the corner and sleep it off, and we'll look after it. And let me point out, though, not every man on that job drank.
Right. But you looked after each other.
That's right.
Yes.
You did.
Okay.
And if the person was incapable of driving home, it wasn't that you left them sitting there. You either you drove them home, or you would put that man in a cab and make sure that he got home safely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the older days, years ago along shore, and we were more of a family. Really
That's
more
right.
of a family than we are now. And
And then, of course, when any time that we were on strike or proposing to go on strike, our union delegates and that would make sure that everything was in order, and make sure, of course, it seemed like any time that our industry ever did go out on strike, it wasn't in the summer months where you could be nice and warm. It always seemed to be when the snow would be flying. And so you always made sure that you would have a fire barrel out there and lots of wood to burn and lots of water to make hot water coffee.
yes.
And then you knew that your strike wasn't going to be that very long, because of course whoever was in government at the time seemed to let you have maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then they would tell us, okay, you're going back to work on a 90-day cooling period, and then if it wasn't settled in the 90 days, you might go out for a little while, and then they would end up telling us, okay, this is the contract that you were about to sign, and if you don't sign it and go against it, you will be up at that time, I think, if I remember correctly, it was up to maybe $1,000 fine a day for each member. Of course, that was after your office staff, your president and vice president or whoever, would recommend the fellow membership what to do. And if you did go against the government or the companies at the time, I remember one time that all our Canadian area president, that was Don Garcia at the time, and they all ended up going to jail for our union rights. And of course, that was one of the scariest times on the waterfront when they went to jail, and each member at the time were liable for a big fine at the time. But overall and all, it seemed to get settled. And back then, our union membership were a lot more of men that were vets and everything, and them men, the companies and the government would not scare them men. They put their back against the wall, and they would tell the younger generation at the time, we have taken enough back steps now, brothers. Our backs are against the wall, and there's only one way to go now, and that's a step forward. And through all our years, I think our local, and not just our local, the majority of longshoremen's through completely around the world, being international, we seem to get pushed back a little bit. But overall, at the end, our union, being as strong as it is, would always to start step forward. And they always looked after each and every union person there was. And our union seems to help other unions out over and over again, where when another union person would be out of work, they could come to our dispatch hall, and they would end up having a job for the day. And through my career on the waterfront, it seemed like our union, that's one thing they always stood up for, was all every union there is, and always tried to give a helping hand. And not too often, though, I've seen too many other unions help our union industry out that much.
Okay, tell us your experience with loading logs.
Oh, that was a great experience too. I preferred being out on the water back in them days. It seemed to be a little bit safer than climbing over the logs after they were down below. Of course, through the years, it has got a lot safer on the logs. There was a few indications when we were out on the water, when maybe a log or two would come back down into the water on us. You just made sure that you were out of the bite at the time. And when you were jumping from one log and another, it was not always the biggest log in the boom that was the safest. A lot of times you'd try and jump on the biggest log in there, and you would end up going for a swim, because that log was so waterlogged that with your weight on it, it would just start to sink. And of course, then when your feet are when you're up to almost your knees in water, you can't jump that well.
You can't jump
and of course, back then you would have a 2-hour return trip where you could go, and if you lived close enough, you could go home and change and come back. And of course, back then there was a few guys that would just seemingly go in just after coffee time at 10 o'clock, and you wouldn't see them till 1 o'clock. And then they would seem to go back in the water around 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
But after a couple of days of that, if that same person would do it 2 days in a row, well, then it was, well, you're staying in the wet clothes.
Yeah.
And of course, the logs back then were huge. And actually, it seemed like most of our log work would not be in the summertime. It always seemed to be in the late fall or early winter months. And sometimes the log booms would come in, and you would have to get like a fire hose and wash the snow off the booms and then go out there.
Right. Did you have your own cork boots or your own equipment, or did the company supply them?
At that time, the company would supply you these little strap-on, I don't know what you would call them, just slip-ons to, and have with the little spikes on them. You're lucky if you got a pair that had good spikes on and good straps, so you could strap them to your boots. Back then there was no logging boots handed out through the companies. If you wanted a pair of logging boots, you would have to walk over to the cop's shoe man or whatever, or Army, Navy, and hope that you could afford to buy a pair. And I'd say most of the people back in them days, they never afford a pair of logging boots. They would just wear what you had.
Yes, wear what you had is right. Now, in your career, the equipment, how has it changed until the end? From the time you started to.
Oh, the equipment now, especially on lift trucks. Back then, you would have your center beam right in front of your eyes, and then you'd have your two change beams on either side of the piston. And your visual window was very limited. There was no such thing as a side shift for your forks, or anytime if you had to adjust your forks, you would have to get off your machine, pull the pins, and if the fella couldn't adjust the forks by the lift truck itself, he would have to get a piece of dunnage and move them over manually. And sometimes they were so tight in there that it would be like you're busting your gut to trying to move the fork around. But if you did know how to drive that lift truck fairly decent, and then when lift trucks did start to improve or side shift, and they would take the center piston out, and where you could have a good view of the cargo that you're working at the time, you kind of thought you were in heaven, and you'd wondered how you ever drove that other piece of equipment that you couldn't see anything. And through the career, there was many drivers that seemed to drive by feel.
Yes. Okay. Now, it was lift trucks. Now, what about the gear in the ship? How did that change?
Oh, well, of course, it went from all standing gear and everything, where you would, a couple times, we ended up having to rig the gear what they called like a live boom. That was before we had any swinging sticks, what they'd call a swinging stick at the time when they first started coming over. And then it went from a swinging stick, and then we went to cranes, which everybody liked to drive till they start lifting the load up, and then they would get a swing into that load, and it was amazing how many loads would be coming right to where that winch driver was sitting. So when they first come over, you wanted to make sure you took it a little cautious. And then, of course, we went to from the cranes, and then the gantries started coming in. And, of course, the first gantry that you've seen, you were quite amazed with that. The only thing with the gantries at that time was you were in a little seat there, and you would trolley along with the load. So the first couple times you would do that, and you're coming to the end of your run, you just prayed that the stops would stop you, so you wouldn't carry on.
Right. Little butterflies in your stomach as you go.
And then, of course, some of our drivers back then, if they knew you were a little nervous in that little room, well, they would go to the end of the boom full tilt. And then, of course, after that, it was the ro-ro ships would start coming in, which was a big change on the waterfront. And then after you were off the ships, and then you were driving lift trucks on the dock, you would seem to go from a lift truck, and then you would have to learn how to drive a front end on what we used to call the sawdust pile at Fraser Surrey docks, or the nickel Matty ore at PCT, where they used to have a rail clamp, and then of course they would have the front ends, and you would pick up the concentrates out of the shed and drop it into a movable hopper on belts that we used to have back then, and it would be you would have to hook up a sling with the lift truck on the belts and move them all around manually, because you would have to take them to each individual hatches at the time, which was very interesting sometimes.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, of course, on the front ends at Fraser Surrey Dock, you would do the sawdust pile, and then they had sawdust come in by rail, and you would do the rail, and or the trucks, I should say, would come to a dumper and dump it, and then you would move it around the site to where they'd want it, and then of course the cat operator would take over and start either pushing it up to store for the day, or if you had a ship in and you were working a ship, the cat operator would push the sawdust down so that the front end drivers could grab it and go dump it into a hopper, and then of course from the hopper it would go up to the ship on belt lines.
Okay. Now, when New Westminster bought out the docks and PCT shut down all the docks on the New Westminster side, how did that affect you?
For myself, it of course losing the work for the local was a big shock, but there, of course, we all still had to go into Westminster to the dispatch hall, and it always seemed a little funny at that time to have to drive into Westminster to drive back to Fraser Surrey Docks for a job. But of course, at that time, the car docks were still going fairly strong. So myself, I lived on the Surrey side of the river. So if I didn't make a car ship, I would end up going to Fraser Surrey Dock. And of course, on after the day's work, it was a lot quicker to get home than fighting the traffic from Annis's Island or Fraser Wharves and back through Westminster to get across to Patella Bridge and that. But no, it was a big shock to our local when Westminster more or less told our longshoreman union hall at the time that we were more or less not welcome in Westminster anymore.
Right, that was a big shock. Now, another thing I want to get here from you is how did you and your fellow workers let off steam? And where did you go at lunchtime? And what did you do at lunchtime? And what did you do after work with your fellow longshoremen?
Oh, for especially if we were in Westminster, it seemed like the best place to kind of get fish and chips or a pickled egg or a hot dog was always in one of the watering holes on Columbia Street. And of course, back then it was if you put a $2 bill on the table, you wanted to make sure you got your 5 beer in you. and of course you would wash down the fish and chips with a nice cold glass of beer, and then if you were on the right job, it seemed like there might have been a 1 or 2 bottles of beer going back to the job with you.
Right. Now, what pub did you usually go to?
Oh, if we were at PCT, it would have been the Best Hotel or the Windsor, and at that time the King Ed was still one of the waterfront's favorite watering holes, and then of course there was the Dunsmuir, the Russell, and then if you were at PCT, it was always the Terminal. The Terminal and the Windsor always seemed to treat the longshoremen with open arms, and actually all the beer parlors back then kind of survived on the longshoremen at the time. for going in at lunchtime, and there would be a certain amount of fellows that even after work would go in and have maybe one or two beer before they would drive off and go home.
Yeah, one or two beer driving off before long. Okay. Now, was there any sports with the longshoremen or people that worked in the docks?
Oh, it seemed like there was quite a few longshoremen through the years were quite athletic. We've had some pretty good ball players in our local. We've had some pretty good hockey players, which if back then there was only the 6 teams in hockey, and many of the longshoremen, not just only in our local, but in the Vancouver local and the locals over in Vancouver Island. We had quite a few pretty good hockey players. If it was today, they would have been playing in the NHL or the semi-pro. But over and all, I think they all enjoyed their career on the waterfront. And same with, I know our local, our local at one time had a baseball team that our local sponsored years ago, and that was in around 1957-58.
What was the name of the team?
It was the Longshoremen. That was the name of the team. And it so happened that this a very highly respected man in our local by the name of Bill Corp. He was like the manager of the longshoreman team, and my father, Walter Briggs, he was the coach with him. And of course, we had many of the guys in the local that used to play on that team. And of course, back then they were supposedly still a little too young to be working, but they after they got old enough, I remember the team from 1958. I'm sure there was 8 or 9 ball players on that ball team that ended up being long-term longshoremen.
Was there, you know much about the River Rats, the team of the River Rats?
Oh, the River Rats, when they first, of course, that was a beer league to start with. It started in roughly 1970. I think around 1975 was the very first team that was called the River Rats, and that was in a 5 fast pitch, and of course that was at the start was more or less just a Sunday day friendly game, and what like I said, it used to be called like what we'd call a beer league. You go play and have a barbecue after, and have a good time out. And then also out of our local, most of our membership won't remember this, but we used to have our own sportsman club out of our hall. We used to have hunting field where now Surrey Golf Course is. We used to lease the property there for hunting ducks and geese at the time. And of course back then once a year we would have a fishing derby, and we would have enormous enough support at our fishing derbies back then, and it was for the members and even the casuals at that time that had a family would take their kids, their sons or daughters, out to have a day outing on the river with their father or their mom and dads, and have a good time. And we seemed to have a really good support back then for the fishing derby, and it seemed like any type of sporting events that our local would have, we always had a pretty good support for it. And then of course once a year, we would have a picnic. Of course, nowadays we have to call it a pensioner picnic. Back then, it was a longshoreman picnic, and there was absolutely no work on the waterfront for that day. It was another day that they try and call it a family day nowadays. But back on the start of my career on the waterfront, our family day was every Sunday because we never worked a Sunday, and it should still be that way.
I agree. I agree on that. Now, did you need any, going back to the work, did you need any special clothes, any special things to work, or just you could just go in as you were?
Oh, never knew what a pair of coveralls were to start with back then.
Mm-hmm.
But no, usually it was a pair of jeans, a Mackinac, a pair of leather gloves, a pair of boots, and away you go. And of course, if you needed the rain gear.
Yeah, you needed the rain gear.
But it seemed like the rain gear always sweated more inside than hold the rain out.
Now, with a gender, what we want to know is, when did women start longshoring? And how did that come about?
Well, it's hard to remember the very first, but at the time we had a fellow by the name of Jimmy Sickma. I was in the office at that time, and that seemed to be the start of women on the waterfront. And I have to admit, still today, I feel that it's not a place for women to be working, even though times have changed and everything. But as we get older and we think back, well, I guess we all have to change with the times a bit. But that was the start of it. Then there was another girl that ended up. She ended up being our very first member of our local, and I will have to praise this lady. I'm not sure of her last name, but her first name was Denise, and she was very, very short. Where a lot of the jobs, like with hooking up the pulp and everything, how we used to hook pulp up on the dock, she would have a hard time struggling, just because she was so short, and that. But if there was one of the gentlemen that would offer to help her out on it, she would turn around and say, "No, thank you. I have to do it on my own." So you do have to show respect to her as being one of our very first women members of our local. But like I say, I am from the old time, and honestly, I feel that there shouldn't be any woman on the waterfront.
Okay, that's a good understanding there. Now, were you proud of your work on the waterfront, looking back at it?
Yes, especially any time I would be driving any kind of equipment on the dock or wherever. I always took pride in the job that I would be doing at the time. And when I left that job, I always liked to, especially if it was stacking lumber out on the yard or whatever, or round newsprint in the shed or pulp in the sheds. If I turn around, I always wanted to see a nice, neat cargo sitting there.
Good. Did you get a sense of achievement, fulfillment on your job when you longshored, or was it just a monotonous type of thing?
No, just about every day was a different day on the waterfront. It was an enjoyable place to work my whole career, and like I say, if, no matter what job you did on the waterfront, you always wanted to take pride in what you did. You didn't you didn't want to turn around and see a lot of damage. If everybody did a lot of damage, well, then of course, what does a lot of damage do? It drives the work away. So anybody that does work on the waterfront and does drive equipment, take pride in it. Eh? And if you feel good about what you done for the day, well, then there shouldn't be any arguments.
Okay. How did working on a waterfront affect your family life or your lifestyle?
Oh, well, of course, being on the waterfront, and especially after they brought in Sunday work and 24 hours a day work and 7 days a week, every longshoreman will tell you that his family life, especially if you had kids, back then, it was a lot of times work was so thin and far between that when there was work, you went to work, and your family life would end up sacrificing because you're always concerned about putting a roof over your kids and giving them clothing, and also make sure they always ate good at night. So a lot of longshoremen did a lot of sacrificing for their family life to support their family.
Yes, we did. And I myself should never have thought we should have worked the Sunday. We should have leave the Sunday.
That's right.
For family.
Yeah, and also, of course, Dean, you would remember when you first started, we just strictly worked Monday to Friday, and if there was a Saturday back then, it was only a half a day, and then of course, then they started bringing in what they called the split shift, where you'd go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then you would go home at noon, and then you would come back at 5 o'clock that evening to, I think it was to finish the ship off, or you only worked to 11 o'clock at that night. But that was the start of bringing in, of course, the 7-day-a-week, 24-hour shift. And of course, that's just another thing that all the older membership would had to start learning to accept, even though a lot of the old time members wished it was still a Monday to Friday job, where you could have a family life with your kids, especially when they're at a younger age.
Yeah, that was tough, and it was tough to make a decision. Am I going to work for double time? Is that helping my do to buy this, or should I stay home? And that was what a lot of us had to think about.
That's right.
Because they put the double time up there to entice you.
That's right.
To work the way, So it was hard on our families. Very hard. Is there anything else that you can think of to talk about longshore and the waterfront that we haven't covered?
Well, like I say, it was always my whole career was always a great place to work. Had a lot of laughs, a lot of good times on the jobs, and if there was any type of disagreement amongst the fellow workers and that, you left that part of the job on the job when you went home. Never take your job back home with you. And when you went back to work, and the fellow that you had a disagreement with the day before, every day was a fresh day. You never carried on.
That's the way it was.
Yeah.
And the old timers told you, "Hey, son, this is the way it is."
That's right.
And you learned from the old timers.
Well, that's right. I wish the younger generation today could have seen what it was like 40, 50 years ago on the waterfront.
Did you ever get hurt on the job?
Yes, I have. I ended up, I got hurt down below one evening. Nothing broken, but a very, very bad ankle sprain. And that was kind of a scary experience when you're in the stretcher being lifted out of the hatch. especially when you had the cargo hook was only maybe 6 inches above your chest. And then after you got past looking at the hook, and then you seen that other great big piece of steel sitting there just above the hook that weighed about 5 ton. And when you're taking a ride out, you would start telling whoever was waiting on the dock side to hold it up in the air because there was no way you wanted that stretcher to touch the dock. Right. And you always wanted to make sure you had a very good experienced winch driver taking you out at the time. And I was only hurt one other time on the waterfront, and that was my first 2 months out at Westshore terminals. Other than that, I've been very fortunate where I never had to be off work due to injuries. Just a couple minor injuries where I wasn't off very long. So I was one of the fortunate ones.
Well, that's good. You're one of the fortunate ones. We hate to have guys getting hurt. Okay.